This talk is called Promoting Excellence Through Action. What we'll be doing here is we'll be discussing how action in Ignatian Pedagogy can help promote excellence. If you remember, when we talked about the Ignatian classroom, one of the three relationships we discussed was the relationship between the learner and the world. And we said that this relationship is actually the most important relationship among the three that we talked about. This relationship should be characterized not only by engagement, but also by excellence. So that's what we'll try to see. We'll see how Ignatian pedagogy, especially its focus on action, will help us promote excellence in this relationship between the learner and the world. It's important to clarify, however, that excellence here does not refer to the usual interpretation. Excellence here refers not so much to test scores or even skills for employability, which are the usual concerns in education today. Rather, excellence refers specifically to what in Ignatian pedagogy is called action. What do we mean by action? In that seminal document, Ignatian Pedagogy, published in 1993, here's this quotation that might help us appreciate what the term means. Quote, "The ultimate aim of Jesuit education is that full growth of the person which leads to action." So the document clarifies that the real aim of Jesuit education is the personal development of the student. However, it should not end with the personal development. It should lead to action. Now, this focus on action is not something unique. Today, in the 21st century, when people talk about learning, they do focus on action as well. Tony Wagner, for example, says what matters today is not how much our students know, but what they can do with what they know. If you recall, we talked about the redefinition of learning in the 21st century, that no longer does it refer to mere recall or mastery of content. Rather, it refers to understanding of content as well as the application of what has been learned, where application, of course, refers to action. We've said that Ignatian pedagogy is reflection-driven, but here we would like to point out not only is Ignatian pedagogy reflection-driven, it is also action-oriented. And the reason for this is, as Ignatian pedagogy, the document puts it, without action, reflection is a truncated process. Usually when people talk about Ignatian pedagogy, they always say reflection is the most important element. And they're right to a certain extent, but as clarified here by the document in 1993, action is absolutely necessary because reflection is but a means to the action, which is the ultimate aim of Jesuit education. So again, this echoes what learning in the 21st century is all about. In the 21st century, learning is understanding of content as well as application of learning. For Ignatian pedagogy, learning is for reflection as well as for action. Action is the end, while reflection is the means. Let me quote from the document more lengthily. "Meanings perceived and judged present choices to be made. Such choices may occur when a person decides that a truth is to be his or her personal point of reference, attitude, or predisposition, which will affect any number of decisions. The student chooses to make the truth his or her own, while remaining open to where the truth might lead." So this refers to interiorized choices. In time, these meanings, attitudes, values which have been interiorized, made part of the person, impel the student to act, to do something consistent with this new conviction. So this one refers to choices externally manifested. So action in Ignatian pedagogy refers to the internal transformation that happens as a result of the learning of the student, but also it refers to the long-term decisions that the student will make as a result of that internal transformation. The problem, however, based on our consultation with practitioners about the practice of Ignatian pedagogy, the problem is that action seems to have been neglected precisely because it focuses on something internal and something long-term. I think what teachers have decided to do is just have this wait-and-see attitude, keeping their fingers crossed that somehow this internal transformation, which is not easy to assess, will lead to the correct long-term decisions. So the challenge facing us today is that is there something more that we educators can do to take action more seriously, to be more deliberate about promoting action in Ignatian pedagogy, even if it's about the internal transformation of the student and the long-term decisions of the students, both of which are not easy to assess. But when you think about it, action in Ignatian pedagogy really refers to what is called today as a transfer of learning or the application of learning that's part and parcel of the definition of 21st century learning. Transfer of learning can be defined as the wise use of content in context. That's a very short, deceptively simple definition, and we will try to unpack that during this talk. But just by looking at the words wise and in context, immediately we are alerted to the fact that this use of content must be informed by understanding. Understanding which is a result of reflection, of course. And also, this use of content must be done in the real world because it's done in context. Now, let's try to see how this is connected to reflection and also to action. Let's look at some examples where transfer of learning doesn't happen. These are cases when students who study hard and perform well in exams are unable to transfer what they have learned beyond their tests. If you remember, we were talking about intellectual constipation as one of the two learning ailments in the 21st century. This is what it means. It means no transfer of learning. Let's take the case of Anita. Anita is an outstanding fifth grader, but to the bewilderment of her mother, she can't seem to estimate the cost of groceries in her cart and finds it difficult to check whether or not she has received the correct change. Now, this doesn't seem to make sense because Anita is an A student even in math. Here's another case. Benny received an A for his essay on the role and responsibility of the youth in promoting social justice. The problem is, he doesn't bother to keep up with the news, claiming he is too young to worry about social issues. Something is not in sync here. There is no transfer of learning despite his A performance in class. And finally, Kathy and her groupmates impressed the class with a presentation on measures that teenagers can take to help preserve the environment. But look at what they do after a meal in the cafeteria. After eating the cafeteria, they do not dispose of their litter in the segregated trash bins just a few feet from their table. There doesn't seem to have been any interior transformation that should have led to a change in behavior. There is no transfer of learning. Now, for us to be able to promote application, for us to be able to promote transfer of learning and action in Ignatian pedagogy, we need to undergo three shifts. Three shifts in our mindset about application. The first is from application later to application now. The second is from out of context application to in context application. And the third is from asking for simple performances from our students to complex performances from them. Let's talk about from application later to application now. Look at this image of a cart put before the horse. In a sense, what educators are saying today is that when we postpone application for later, we are putting the cart in front of the horse. Let's try to find out what they mean by that. The prevailing attitude among teachers today is that we want to postpone application until after our students have mastered the content. Our usual reason is that they need to master the content first. How can they apply what they've learned if they haven't learned it first? So the paradigm, the mindset is that content mastery is important before any application. But the challenge for us educators today is that we need to put that mindset aside. The thought today is that application itself will aid content mastery. We shouldn't wait for students to master the content 100% because first of all, it probably will never happen. But secondly, if we wait too long, we probably will not have time for application. So if we postpone application, what's going to happen is we'll never end up giving our students a chance to use and apply what they've learned. If we give our students the opportunity to use and apply their learning, that process of application will actually help them learn more and help them master the content. And just to show us how ridiculous it is to have the first mindset on insisting on content mastery first, how many of us use our phone only after we master the manual? Many of us don't even bother reading the manual. We just use the cell phone immediately and just figure things out as we go along. In short, we're already applying now and we're learning in the process. So that's the first shift. A shift from application later, because we're insisting on content mastery first, to application now, because application now will actually aid learning and increase learning. The second shift is a shift from out of context application to in context application. To understand what this shift is all about, let me read to you a quote from Walter where he writes about playing the game. You don't learn to play baseball by a year of batting practice. The way to let young learners play the whole game is to find or construct a junior version of it. A junior version may involve fewer innings, a diamond that is smaller than standard, or teams consisting of whoever shows up in the park on a given day. Yet the junior version conveys the essence of baseball, swinging at and hitting a ball, and then making your way around the bases while the opposing team scrambles to put you out. He's making a distinction here between drills and the game. What he's trying to say is that you don't learn how to play baseball by engaging in the drills, in the batting practice, even if you do so for a year. The reason is drills are out of context. They're out of the context of the game. The only way to learn is to try to apply your skills in the context of the game. In the same way, in the classroom, if we want our students to apply what they've learned, the best way to do it is not through drills, which are out of context, but through real-world applications. So, in-context application refers to long-term, worthwhile, and complex challenges in the discipline and the real world. And this has to be done already now, not later. Here we're talking about authentic assessments, which we will discuss in greater detail later on. But in-context application must be complex, messy, and ambiguous, because that's what happens in the real world, in real life. In-context applications deal with incomplete, disorganized, and contradictory information, because that's what we find in the real world, in real life. Finally, in-context applications require judgment on which knowledge and skills to use from a repertoire of knowledge and skills. In short, you don't tell the students that for this particular application, you're going to use this concept or this idea or this skill. You're going to leave it up to them to make the decision, to decide, to make the judgment which of the knowledge and skills is going to be relevant for this application. And why? Because that's what happens in the real world. That's what happens in real life. Let's examine in greater detail the differences between out-of-context application and in-context application. Let's look at out-of-context applications first. They are drills and exercises. They consist of tasks that require the use of discrete concepts and simple skills. So the questions they ask are very neatly defined. They're unrealistically set up and prompted with the tools and equations already prescribed for the students. On the other hand, in-context applications deal with messy problems. They consist of tasks which require judgment, as we've said earlier, on which knowledge or skills to use from a whole repertoire. So in-context applications deal with ill-structured problems or messy challenges with minimal scaffolding or even incomplete or conflicting data. So obviously, in-context applications are much more challenging than the usual drills we give our students, but that's the best way for students to learn how to apply what they've learned in the real world. Here's an example of an out-of-context application and an in-context application. The out-of-context application is something very common, something we find very frequently. So the question goes, find X. So the problem is very neat. Everything the student needs to know is already there. It's already laid out for him. All the student needs to do now is compute for x by doing some algebra. Now compare this out-of-context application to an in-context application. So there's a situation. It's now 7:50 p.m. The movie is about to start at 8:15. You don't want to miss the beginning, but there's a long line of people and there are 122 people ahead of you. It takes 90 seconds for 8 people to get their tickets. Will you make it? So it's a messy problem. It's not a neat problem. Unlike the example of the out of context application, the student doesn't just perform the problem solving. The student first needs to figure out how to solve the problem, what data are available, are the data adequate for him to solve the problem. Of course, we hope that the student will be able to figure out that what he needs to do to solve this messy in-context problem is to engage in proportional reasoning and actually use an equation similar to the one on the left side. So much for the second shift. The third shift is from simple performances to complex performances. The point we want to make here is that usually we demand from our students to only deliver simple performances. What do I mean by that? Usually, we only distinguish between difficult subject matter and easy subject matter. When we're designing our assessments, we only classify them based on their level of difficulty, whether the subject matter is easy or the subject matter is hard. If we want to promote transfer of learning as well as action in Ignatian pedagogy, we can't just think of levels of difficulty. We also should think of levels of complexity in the performance we ask from our students. We should think in terms of whether we're asking for a simple performance or a complex performance. And the point here is that we should also consider asking for complex performances because in-context applications call for complex performances. Let's look at this diagram and examine it closely to understand what I'm talking about here. So let's focus our attention on the left side of the diagram, the two quadrants on the left side. So at the bottom, you have easy subject matter, but simple performance. And on top of that, you have difficult subject matter, but still simple performance. So usually, we teachers are stuck in these two quadrants. The kind of assessments we design for our students vary in terms of the level of difficulty of the subject matter, but usually the performance we ask from our students is simple. So the challenge for us educators is to widen our own repertoire so we don't just demand for simple performances from our students, but we also ask for more complex performances, whether we're dealing with a subject matter that's easy or difficult. So in this diagram, I'd be referring to the two quadrants on the right side. The lower right side quadrant would deal with easy subject matter but requiring complex performance, while the one on top of that will be difficult subject matter requiring complex performance. Let's look at some examples. So here are some examples of things we ask from our students when we want to assess their knowledge and skills. Can we try to figure out the level of difficulty of subject matter as well as the level of complexity of performance that we are dealing with? The first one is write an essay using the subjunctive mood. The second is explain the contributing factors that led to World War I. The third is enumerate the 10 commandments. And the fourth is transform verbs from active to passive voice. Let's spend a few minutes using the categories I just discussed with you, classifying these 4 tasks that we assign to our students. How did you find the exercise? Let's discuss the items in detail. Let's begin with the quadrants with a simple performance. So the easy subject matter, enumerate the 10 commandments. That would be easy subject matter. It only calls for recall. So it's also simple performance. What about transform verbs from active to passive voice? The subject matter could be considered more difficult, but the performance remains simple. Now compare these two tasks to the task on the right side. Let's begin with the one in the lower quadrant, to write an essay using the subjunctive mood. That's rather easy in terms of subject matter, but the performance is now more complex because now the student is being asked to write an essay. But of course, the one on the upper right-hand quadrant, to explain the contributing factors that led to World War I, the subject matter is difficult and the performance is also complex. If we compare the four tasks, we can say that the two tasks on the right side, those that we consider complex performances, are real world tasks. These are things we actually do in the real world. So this is why asking for complex performances from our students are rehearsing them, practicing them, and giving them the opportunity to have a real world application, a junior version of what it means to apply what you know in the real world. Let's think of four more examples. So the first is identify the parts of a living cell. The second task is to answer the question, when is it best to use mean, median, or mode to represent central tendency? The third, how does a city's geography affect its culture and economy? And finally, write a paragraph using active and passive voices. So again, let's spend a few minutes just to classify these four tasks. Okay, I hope you did better this time around. Let's discuss the answers. And as usual, we begin with the left-hand side, the simple performances. Let's begin at the bottom. Easy subject matter, simple performance, identify the parts of a living cell. Again, all it's requiring from the student is recall. What about the one on top of that? Write a paragraph using active and passive voices. It's more difficult, the subject matter is more difficult, but the performance is still relatively simple. Let's go to the other side, the complex performances. When is it best to use mean, median, or mode to represent central tendency? It's a relatively easy subject matter, but it calls for a complex performance. This decision is a real-world decision. When you're presenting data, it's important for you to answer this question, to be able to answer this question. When is it best to use mean, median, or mode? So that's a more complex performance. But of course, the most difficult and also complex would be, how does a city's geography affect its culture and economy? To be able to account for the different factors and their interaction with one another, that's a very complex task, but it's also a very real-world task. So we've talked about the three shifts in this talk. The shift from application later to application now. The shift from out-of-context application to in-context application. And the shift from asking for simple performances from our students to complex performances from them. These three shifts are necessary if we want to be able to promote transfer of learning in our classroom. And in Ignatian Pedagogy, if we want our learning to be action-oriented, if we want to promote action in the classroom, then these three shifts are necessary conditions to be able to do that. I'll see you later.